So it's a great pleasure to introduce Larry Cornelis. Larry is a certified conservationist, horticulturalist, and a true naturalist. He's passionate about all things nature, and he shares that passion in every presentation. He's received many awards from naturalist groups, including local clubs and Ontario Nature, Carolinian Canada, Ministry of Natural Resources, and many others. Larry and Wendy recently moved to the family farm, which is known as Honey Locust Homestead near Wallisford on the Sydenham River. And Wendy and Larry live there along with their daughter Becky and son-in-law Nick. So welcome, Larry.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, what a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this for a while. Should I move the camera a little bit more? Yeah, great to see y'all. And it's been, I don't know, a couple of years, maybe more than a year, that's for sure. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I was very pleased to be invited. And the topic I was given, can we start the? Yeah, so I was asked to give a presentation about habitat restoration. So what I'm going to share with you is what I've learned through experience and through education and reading and that stuff, but a lot of experience. I've had decades now of working in the field of conservation and restoration, locally, mostly locally. So I do have things to share, and everything I'm sharing is what I believe to be true. And we're going to talk about habitat restoration. But I'm going to take it to some different levels. You may just expect that Larry's going to come and talk about who's planting trees and where they're planting trees, who's planting prairie and where they're planting prairie. And I will talk about that, but I'm also going to try and do a bit bigger picture of this whole topic. And I'm going to cover some history and what's happened over the past hundreds of years, and then focus down to what I think we're doing today and what I like to see us doing today. And it's actually pretty interesting, really. So we're not just going to talk about sticking trees in the ground, we're going to talk about a bunch of different things. So here we have Gabby and Kiva, and these are two young ladies who work for Ontario Nature. And I think some of you know that Ontario Nature finally bought a property in Lambton County called the Sydenham River Nature Reserve. And it's 200 acres. See, what year was it? 17, I think we bought it, 2017. And this year we're trying to add 100 acres to it, make it a 300-acre nature reserve. And we're still fundraising for that. The acquisition price is $500,000, plus you need extra money to run the campaign and do things. So, so we're still fundraising to add that extra 100 acres to the 200. And that's up near Alvinston on the Sydenham River. So these two young ladies were up. We had a couple of weekends ago, we had 2 weekends where we were trying to get 900 trees planted by hand. And most of them were like 1 meter to 2 meters high. And as you can see, they were being planted in what we call a nurse crop of Tallgrass Prairie, actually. So first we put in the Tallgrass Prairie, and I'll explain all that later, and then we plant the trees so that the Tallgrass Prairie keeps away all of the European weeds and all that would just naturally come up anyway. It's worked really, really well there. But first I'm going to talk a little bit about why do we do this? And that's mainly the bad stuff, right? And I'm not going to focus on the bad stuff for very long. Okay, it's not advancing. Back one. Okay, I think it's working now. Okay, so why are we involved in habitat restoration? Because it's basically based on what we've lost, you know, what we've done, the human impact on the landscape, on nature. And it's mostly negative things like habitat loss, introducing alien species, climate change, pollution, poor land management. There's a lot of reasons why we want to do this sort of thing. Habitat loss. But obviously we do have to grow food and farm land. But habitat loss is probably the main thing. And you think, well, that was happening, you know, a century ago or more, but no, it's still happening today. Kent County's down to 4% forest cover, and we've lost thousands of acres in the last couple of years. And they're going to get it down close to zero, I think, if you continue to let them. Lambton County has about 9% forest cover. I'll talk a bit more about that. But no, habitat loss is still happening, and that's the result. Actually, Mark and I were talking about Highway 402 a minute ago. There's Highway 402. Okay, so not only do we eliminate most of the landscape. This is the London line. This is Michigan Ave. These woods were in the back of all the farm properties. Where do you put a highway? Yeah, right through all of the nature, right? You just totally destroyed that corridor and that habitat for wild animals and different things. So just not thinking, we never really considered nature in the big picture, right? We needed a highway. We weren't going to put it across the middle of the fields. The farmers would have we put it through the woods. But anyways, and then there's the introduced pests and diseases and all that are really impacting our landscape, our forests, our prairies, everything. Like, there's so many now. The emerald ash borer in particular, recently, you see this block of woods, see all the gray in it? Those are all dead trees. Yeah, like probably half of that block of woods was ash, and it was killed off by the ash borer. And this is in Mandamin Woods, on Mandamin Road there. Lambton Wildlife owns this property. Look at all the trees laying everywhere. Those are all ash trees that fell down. For a while, it looked all gray from the sky. Now when you fly over the sky, you don't see the gray anymore because all the trees are laying on the ground dead. So now you just see what green is left. So that's been a huge impact. So a lot of bad things like that, but that's enough talk about the bad things. Let's talk about why we want to do it on the happy side, okay? Because we love nature, because we care for it, because we need nature. You know, I mean, I could do a whole hour talk on the benefits of walking through the woods, of forest bathing, about how your blood pressure comes down. You get relaxed, you feel a lot better, you breathe healthier air, you breathe in pheromones and chemicals from the trees that none of us are breathing on a daily basis, that humans used to breathe every day. There's huge benefits. And so those are some of the reasons. Who wouldn't want to go for a walk in those woods? Who wouldn't want to go for a walk in a full out bloom prairie meadow with all the colorful flowers and the butterflies and the grassland birds? These are beautiful places, and they're, you know, in some ways they're holy places, right? And they've really, really been impacted. Old growth forests and old growth trees. Here's a friend of mine, Mark, taking a picture of a almost 7-foot diameter tulip tree down in North Carolina. I've been there 3 times now. I just can't stop going back, although maybe I'm done going back to the States now with COVID, I don't know. But yeah, well, there's hardly any old growth forest left, like less than 1%. Even forest interior habitat, which is habitat that's at least 100 meters from the edge of the woods. Once you get past 100 meters, you're in what we call forest interior habitat. That first 100 meters is impacted by sun and heat and wind and predators more. So we have less than 1% forest interior habitat left. So that's the negative again, but there's a lot of good reasons. Who doesn't want to see old growth trees? I mean, it's just a pleasure to stand beside a living organism that's 7 feet in diameter. These are like 165 feet tall and 350 years old. You know, how about snakes? You know, yeah, everybody loves the flowers and everybody loves the trees, but does everybody love the snakes and other things? We'll talk about that a bit too. So this is actually my son-in-law, Nick, holding a fox snake. We have quite a healthy population of fox snakes on our farm. They're an endangered species. That one measured 52 inches. I found a skin recently that measured 62 inches. I've got the complete skin mounted on a board, totally intact from the jaw all the way down to the tail. So, but yeah, most people say, well, I don't want anything to do with snakes, but they belong there too, right? So let's look at the history of restoration and conservation history. I'm going to go all the way back to when the First Nations peoples were here and there were no Europeans. Okay, and I mean no disrespect. I have great like respect for First Nations, how their culture, how they live. It's been important to me actually my whole life. On our family farm, we found a lot of Indian artifacts over the years, and I've just always been interested in First Nations. So they practiced an incredible sustainable land care. They took care of nature. They were part of nature. They lived in harmony. We like to say they lived in harmony with nature, and they were maintaining things. It was a model of sustainability for humans. And we're not just talking about a few humans. There were as many First Nations peoples living in North America as there were in Europe when Columbus arrived. Estimates are between 20 and 60 million. Usually they say 30 million, and the population of Europe was around 30 or 40 million at the time. Just as many people there, and they lived in harmony with nature. But why were they living in harmony with nature? Because really it was to support themselves. They were driven by desire to shape and maintain ecosystems as habitat to support themselves. That's not habitat restoration. That's not ecocentric restoration. An ecocentric meaning based on ecology, on ecological values and things like that. They were doing it to support themselves. It was an harmonious thing. And then you say, well, are humans part of nature? We'll talk about that a little bit more too. They were not concerned about endangered species or endangered spaces. It wasn't on their radar. They were concerned about dinner and clothing and stuff like that, right? So that wasn't restoration or conservation they were doing. It's a little bit different. There's Christopher Columbus, okay? Besides looking for silver and gold, he was looking for the Garden of Eden. The kings and the queens of Europe wanted somebody to find the Garden of Eden. Well, he never found it, which actually surprises me to think that you can land on places like Trinidad and Hawaii and not think you found the Garden of Eden, but they said, no, we haven't found the Garden of Eden. So in Europe, they started creating these botanical gardens to try to recreate the Garden of Eden. They were trying to restore the land to what they thought the original garden, what humanity was placed in, through having botanical gardens. That was not restoration, right? Trying to recreate the Garden of Eden. This is Kew Gardens in London, England. Then we come to the national park system, which started in about 1872 in the United States and Canada. Yellowstone was the first national park. I'm a big fan of going to visit the Great Smoky Mountains, which may be done now too, I don't know. But were they really managed as like conservation and restoration kind of things? It's a little complicated. So these are the list here are the things that were probably negative towards conservation and restoration and maintaining species and habitats. First of all, they expelled the Native Americans. Well, that was probably a mistake, right? They lived in harmony with nature for so long. Then they controlled the big predators. Well, you can't have, the grizzly bears and mountain lions running around if you're making it a park where people are going to go to, right? Then they started introduce fish and different wildlife came. That was for people just so they could come fishing and hunting. But that wasn't ecological restoration. They suppressed fire. Well, fire is a natural process of habitats and ecology. You got to have fire from time to time. So they stopped the fires, so that impacted things. They controlled the insects. They winter fed popular species. People love to go to Smoky Mountains and see elk. So they feed the elk and they reintroduce the elk to feed them. And so now there's fields maintained. So that's not restoration. Scenery enhancement. You know, they have these cutouts, you know, in different places, and they cut all the trees down so you get the view of the valleys and the mountains and things like that. Well, that's not conservation or restoration. And then they extract timber, and believe it or not, national parks, they extract timber and minerals and fish and different things. So all these things were going on in the national parks historically. I'm talking historically, okay? So they've learned from that. And it was in the early 1900s when there was a few new young biologists who came and said, wait a minute, why do we have these parks really? And they started turning their directive and their aims and goals towards nature and maintaining ecosystem health and things like that. So that's come around. It's not completely come around. As an example, the Great Smoky Mountains. That's the most visited park in the United States of America. Between 9 and 10 million people visit the Smoky Mountains every year. Most visited park. So that has an impact, right? That's a lot of human beings, a lot of cars, and a lot of impact. But they were preserved to preserve nature to some level. So that's a little history on that. Aldo Leopold, he was constantly expressing that we need a land ethic. We need to be connected to the land. He was promoting conservation and restoration and different things. One of his quotes is that no one shall ever again see the silphiums tickling the bellies of the bison. You know, he said that. He died, I think, in 1940 something. And actually, that's not true today. And we'll talk about that a bit. You actually can see the silphiums tickling the bellies of the bison today, which is pretty exciting for me to be able to say that. And then if you just Google Aldo Leopold's name and put in quotes, it's just pages and pages and pages, and a lot of really, really nice quotes. And I like this one here. If we see the land as a community to which we belong, we may learn to love and respect it. Because our culture does not see land as a community we belong to. We see it as a resource. We see it as creating wealth, in my opinion. All wealth is created from nature. I know the stock market, but everything starts, you go to Walmart, everything you buy, it all originated in nature. You know, everything originated in nature. So, how about the conservation organization? Okay, well, they started out in the 1800s and 1900s, depending which one you're talking about, and they had great intentions, great goals, and one of them was to let nature take its course. In the beginning, like we're talking 50, 100 years ago, that was their perspective. Let nature take its course. Nature can't make any mistakes. Nature's good. Like, we shouldn't be messing around with things. Let nature take its course. Well, over the decades, they started to realize that turned into neglect. And then there's so many impacts over the last century of introduced species and different diseases and things that you can't just walk away and leave it alone, because it's going to really get impacted. So that was, now today, they are totally, these kinds of organizations, Nature Conservancy of Canada, the Nature Conservancy, which is global, it's based out of the States, but that one's global. They're actually not connected to each other. They are probably leaders in ecocentric, ecology-based restoration today and habitat restoration. But at the beginning, they weren't. This is actually pretty complicated. You know, you're playing around with the planet and with nature. It's pretty complicated. And as you can see, there's a lot of different ways you can go. Reintroduction of the Great Plains bison. So then we went to this idea of the keystone species. Every habitat has a keystone species. So prairies almost can't be prairies without bison. Not because the bison isn't missing, but because the bison impact, enhance, influence the prairie habitat. So when you have a herd of bison walking across a prairie, their sharp hooves are digging into the soil. They're eating, grazing as they go along. They're impacting the habitat. And when you take that away, all of a sudden, there's nothing grazing, the plants grow denser and thicker, woody stuff starts to come in, and you end up losing the prairie, except in the really, really driest areas of the prairies, the short grass prairies. Not too many woody plants will grow there because it's only like 7 inches of rain a year. But in the mixed grass and the tallgrass prairie, if it isn't maintained somehow by either fire or huge herds of herbivores eating it, it'll turn into a forest, shrubby woody forest and things like that. So let's introduce the keystone species. That'll take care of everything, right? It'll help the prairie. But what does it do for the endangered burrowing owl? What does the endangered burrowing owl need? Endangered burrowing owl needs prairie dog, gopher, because that's where they lay their eggs, down in the gopher holes. Down, they're burrowing owls. They don't make the burrows. They just live in burrows. They don't have the ability to dig out long tunnels underground. So, you know, okay, we reintroduced the bison, but what about these guys, right? So the ecosystem isn't complete. Not just two. That's just two examples, right? What about the grizzly bears? Actually, this should have been the first thing they introduced. As soon as they were introducing bison, they should have been introducing grizzly bears. They are now extirpated, gone from the Great Plains. Grizzly bears are actually a Great Plains creature that we have forced to the foothills and the mountains. We eliminated them where people were farming and doing things. We got rid of them. The thing that grizzly bears do, and there's a little video you can watch about Yellowstone. And the title is, How Do Wolves Change Rivers? Okay, I probably mentioned that before. What the grizzly bears do is they chase the bison. They hunt the bison. So now, instead of the bison standing lazily all day long in the same spot, eating everything they want, now you got a grizzly bear coming along and 1,000 bison start stampeding to some other area because this grizzly bear is chasing to the catches one, and then they're all okay for a while. So you need that big predator. That impact of 1,000 bison or even more pounding the turf really helps the prairie come back. It brings up seed, it eliminates too many plants, like too much dense turf. So without the grizzly bear, the bison isn't doing its total role on the prairie. So we need the grizzly bears. But who wants to introduce grizzly bears? Should we introduce black bears to pinery? Like we would want black bears in pinery, right? You're sitting in your tent. So these are like examples of where restoration should go. There's also this whole thought now, we're calling it extreme restoration, right? So there are biologists, and this is being promoted globally in different places, Russia in particular, that we should be reintroducing mammoths and mastodons onto the tundra and different landscapes, because that's what was there 15,000 years ago. Right? And they're gone now. And maybe the tundra needs mastodons and mammoths, woolly mammoths and things like that. So this is being promoted. There's another train of thought when it comes to restoration, especially for North America in particular, is that we should be targeting 1491. I'll talk a bit about that a little bit more. But yeah, like, really, we're going to bring back mastodons? There's a few books that promote this kind of stuff. There's one book titled Camels Belong in North America, and another one In Defense of Disturbed Land. So there's always somebody coming from a different angle on all these things. Actually, one thing I should mention is that this is fuel for a lot of conflict, the stuff I'm talking about. I'll talk a bit about that a little bit more, but there's just so many different ideas and different things you can do, right? So what is it today? What am I thinking? What am I going to share with you today? What have I been involved with? And I keep going back to the word ecocentric restoration, meaning ecology-based, nature-based. What is it? And how do you do it? And so, first of all, it has to be a big focus on native species, not introduced species. And we could talk about that for an hour as to why, but it's important. Our native wildlife evolved with our native species. You can't take our native wildlife and put it in Europe or Asia and expect them to survive. And you can't bring animals from here because they don't have relationships, evolutionary relationships with the flora of the land, especially insects. And they're kind of like the foundation of the whole food web, insects. If you lose the insects, you're going to lose almost everything. You remove the alien species. So I've written a number of conservation management plans for landowners, and these are the things I put in them. You got to use native species. You got to get rid of the alien species. You got to control some animal populations. You know, Pinery used to have 1,000 deer in it. They're trying to keep it down to around 100, 150. When there were 1,000 white-tailed deer in Pinery, they were stunted. They were weak. They weren't doing well. There just wasn't enough food for that many deer, but there was nothing to control the numbers of deer. We don't have the grizzly bears or the black bears, you know what I mean? Controlling animal populations, controlling invasive species may also include native species, okay? So there's alien introduced invasive species, they're really bad. But we also have native species that, I'm gonna use the word invasive, I don't like to use that word for native species, but they can dominate a landscape and prevent the land from evolving. Canada goldenrod is one. So I'm involved in a lot of Tallgrass Prairie restoration, and we do not want Canada goldenrod. We want other goldenrods, because there are a lot of goldenrods that are clump forming, what I call well-behaved goldenrods. Canada goldenrod sends out long rhizomes, and I can show you pictures of some Tallgrass Prairie projects we did probably 10 or 12 years ago that are totally Canada goldenrod. You got in there and it just takes over. It's a native plant, and naturally in nature, it had a role when nature was functioning the way it should. But today it's just footloose and fancy free, we'll say, because we've opened up the land so much, and now Canada goldenrod, the seed can blow for miles. Just, you know, we try to do a prairie planting, and Canada goldenrod gets in there, it takes over. So you even might have to control some native species. And then use prescribed burns. You know, like I said, the national parks banned burning, they stopped all the fires, fire suppression. Well, we need fire in some habitats. It helps to maintain them and helps to control things. So who is doing it? Who's involved in it? I mean, I've had a wonderful opportunity for decades now to be involved in conservation and restoration and especially protection. And there's a lot of people involved. It might surprise you. Obviously, you may say, well, yeah, naturalist organizations, non-government conservation organizations, yeah, stewardship councils, land trusts. Land trusts are really growing over the last few decades. Conservation authorities, and now it's big business. Actually, there are restoration organizations in the United States that have multi-million-dollar a year businesses going, doing restoration work on the ground for profit. Okay, most of this is not for profit, and it includes a lot of volunteers. It includes a lot. When you include the for-profit ecological restoration companies and all the NGOs and all of the naturalist clubs, we're talking like tens of thousands of people are involved in this. And you know, 60 years ago, when I was born, it wasn't even hardly even heard of. Like, it really wasn't. So it's really, really come on. And it's such a pleasure to be involved in this. It's such a joy to walk in the Sydenham River Nature Reserve and know that that is now protected in perpetuity, like forever, from being cleared and farmed or harvested or whatever, you know. To be involved in that, to be able to plant trees on that property, and to know that we saved it, and numerous other properties. We have a lot of good things going on in Lambton County. A lot of new reserves, a lot of conservation properties, a lot of private landowners. Community-based restoration. This is really growing in North America and probably globally. Australia is kind of big on it too. Australia's history with the landscape is very in line with ours. They got there about the same time as people got here, and they impacted the land in the same way over the centuries and decades. But here's all these people. We got young people, people planting trees, people surveying mussels and different things in the rivers. We got people doing bird surveys. You got to know what's there when you're going to manage it, when you're going to do some conservation work. So there's a lot of different things you can be involved in. All you guys can be involved in almost on a weekly basis. That's how much is going on. I could almost go out every week and be involved in some part of the project that's involved conservation and restoration. A lot going on. Community-based, children. We got to get the little kids out doing these things too. This is at Amjanong, a bunch of little kids planting their turtle garden, which is a garden of native plants. Private landowners. This has become big business too. This is our farm. We have named our farm the Honey Locust Homestead because along this field, there's a row of 11 honey locusts that I believe are 140 to 150 years old. They're like 80, 90 feet tall, really big. And they're the nice wild ones with thorns sticking out this long, multi-branch thorns and hundreds of pods in the female trees. So we've named the farm the Honey Locust Homestead. But with permission from my uncle and family, we, from here, this line kind of all along here, everything from that line to the river is a nature preserve now. It's all natural. It was a soybean field when we did it, when we started it, but it's all natural. So you can do this on your own landscape and you can get funding for it. There's funding to help you do these things. Sometimes 100%, sometimes only 50%, depends what you're looking at and where you live, but you can get funding to do these things. So there's a huge community-based restoration movement going on in North America, and probably globally. It's really peaking, I think, right now. Volunteering. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to volunteer for your community, but volunteer ecological restoration movement is bringing so many people together, and it's bringing, people working with nature together change. They learn things, they see things, they change. It connects them to nature. I mean, if you don't know something, how can you care about it, right? How many people today do not know anything about nature? How can you care about it if you don't know about it? Well, getting engaged in conservation work and restoration work, you learn a lot because the people you're working with, the professionals, will share and teach you a lot, and the experience teaches you a lot. And it's just a great thing that's happening that's bringing people together and linking ecology with sociology and history. Like it's a culture thing, and we need to, it's the land ethic that Aldo Leopold was talking about. You get to learn what the community, you're a part of the community of the landscape. You get to learn that, being involved in this. Here's some young people planting beach grass here in Sarnia on a very crummy day, by the way. Look at the weather there. I think it was drizzling and the waves were crashing on the beach and it was cold. They got winter coats on. But yeah, we get out and do those kinds of crazy things. Here's the tree planting and the prairie planting I mentioned at the beginning. So there's a lot of tree planting going on. This is bigger scale, landscape models. They don't want to plant less than 1 or 2 acres. They want to plant 20 or 50 acres. We want to get as much on the landscape as possible. This is the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, our local conservation authority, planting at a friend's place of mine. So they plant trees in rows, and then they maintain them by spraying and mowing for 3 years to get the trees going. And they grow trees fantastic. They grow trees so fast. They do a fantastic job of growing trees. They have really high survival rates, like 90-some%. They do a great job. But I don't consider that ecocentric restoration. Because they planted 4 or 5 species, used to plant 1 or 2, at least now they're planting a few, maybe several. It's in straight rows. The mowing encourages turf grass. Turf grass is not good to create habitat on. It's not good for most of nature, most of wildlife, that sort of thing. But planting trees is a darn good thing, and we need a lot more trees. So I've included it as a restoration conservation thing. There's another way to recreate forest or woods, and this is another one of those controversial things. It's called pit and mound. if you had the opportunity to walk in an old growth forest, like a truly old growth forest, the topography, the landscape is undulating, and there's pits and mounds and hills and bumps everywhere. And that's because it's an untouched, by humanity, untouched, and it's been there for thousands of years. And over those thousands of years, huge trees have blown over in storms. The roots have ripped out of the ground. They pulled all the dirt with them. They left a pit. And then when they rot away, because we're talking thousands of years, their material, their organics, and the soil they brought with now piles down beside the pit, and you have this pit and mound undulating topography. And what's wonderful about that for nature is that it holds moisture. And that's what we want to do on these flat fields, is hold moisture. When you can add water to a landscape, you're doing it a lot of good. Okay. You see here's a pit full of water, right? All these pits will be full of water numerous times a year. Some of them actually have been full of water all year round. Whereas if that was a flat field and you had an inch or 2 inch rain, the whole field was wet. And a week later, the whole field is dry. And there's only a few things that can grow in that situation. I mean, it's not a very forgiving situation. And you're either drowning or you're in a drought, you know, kind of. So there are a few, I guess maybe what we might call weedy species that can handle that. You know, willows and cottonwoods and silver maples, things like that. But you need to hold the moisture on the land, and this does it. Now, some biologists don't like it because you can't go in there and plant trees mechanically now. You can't mechanically weed, mow, and spray, things like that, so they don't like it. And that's why I said the Conservation Authority grows trees really fast, really well. They will have trees, big trees on the landscape long before this will. But 100 years from now, this will have biodiversity, because so many different species would have had the opportunity to germinate beside the water, in the water, on top of the hill, between the pits and mounds. Every kind of moisture level you can think of is provided in there. So I really like it. And this was my suggestion to Ontario Nature. And Nature Conservancy has done a lot of it. So we did 2 fields at the St. Anne River Nature Reserve, pit and mound topography. Stopped advancing. Here we go. Wetland construction. Well, locally in our area, we've lost 90-some% of our wetlands. So that's important too. So I've been involved in a lot of these projects. This is at the St. Anne River Nature Reserve again. We had ponds, we had vernal pools. Vernal meaning springtime. It's flooded in the springtime, and then it dries out in the summer. And you need those for things like amphibians. They lay eggs in there, and before it dries out in July or August, the tadpoles have grown into frogs and toads, and out they come. And when it dries out, that eliminates predators like fish and different like dragonfly nymphs that would eat the eggs and the tadpoles. If you have fish in a pond, you're not going to end up with tadpoles. The fish will gobble them all up. So vernal pools provide amphibians an opportunity to grow. So that's what we're trying to create there. Tallgrass Prairie, 99.73% of tallgrass prairie in North America is gone. 99.73%. Pretty much extirpated, right? I mean, that's just a huge impact, because it was the easiest thing to do. You showed it, you're a European, you showed up, you wanted a farm. Here was this big prairie. You started a fire, you burned it off, you got out your oxen or your horse or eventually your tractor, you plowed it, and you're in business. So boom, it was gone. And tallgrass prairie gets enough rain to farm. We're in tallgrass prairie fringe of it, and that's typically 30 inches of rain. Well, that's great farming. If you can get 30 inches of rain, that's good farming. Shortgrass prairie gets 7 inches of rain. You can't farm that. All you can do is put 1 cow. And I asked the guy in Montana, 1 cow for 200 acres is what they put on. I said, what? And well, not much else. There's just not much there. It's almost desert. 7 inches of almost desert. So we planted thousands of acres of tallgrass prairie just in southern Ontario, locally, thousands of acres. Tree planting. There's been millions of trees planted on thousands of acres since the 60s when the Conservation Authorities reformed. millions of trees. The St. Clair Region Conservation Authority has planted millions of trees, let alone all the other ones combined, like millions of trees. So we've done a lot of work. Now this is expensive. I should mention the cost a bit. Tallgrass Prairie is somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500 an acre. Tree planting's more. Wetland construction's more. Half-acre pond probably costs you between $6,000 and $10,000 to have excavated, and that probably doesn't include planting seeds and things afterwards. Just to have the excavation done. That's pretty expensive to bring in big excavators and bulldozers and things like that. So that's expensive, but you can be involved in less expensive restoration work, doing it yourself on your own property. And as I said, there's funding available for a lot of this. That's really grown a lot over the past 3 or 4 decades, the availability of funding. I'm done, pretty much. Okay, prescribed burns, we do that all the time now. Restoration or creation. I'm going to throw a wrench into the gearbox here just for a second, okay? I'm past my time. What are we really doing today? Is it restoration or is it creation? What is our goals and aims? Here's a 1978 Ford pickup F100. You can restore that 100% to exactly what it was. 57 Chevy, take your pick. You can restore it to exactly, you get all the parts, you get all the professionals on how to do it, you can restore that. But we don't have all the parts left to restore nature. We don't have the old growth forest. We don't have the freshwater mussel. We don't have bears in Lambton County. You know, like we've lost so many of the pieces. We've lost ash trees in the last decade or two. Elm trees barely make it. Most of them don't go to maturity. We've lost sweet chestnuts, American chestnuts, almost a century ago. We don't have all the parts anymore. I was at a dedication recently involving friends of mine. Stan and Anita Caveney donated 105 acres to the Thames Talbot Land Trust. And Stan gave a talk at the dedication. What a wonderful donation, right? Like 105 acres, that's just amazing. It's got forest on it, but he's also created ponds and wetlands and prairie land. And he said, you know, if you're really doing true restoration, we should have made the whole thing forest. He said, but we can't. We don't have all the species that were here 100 years ago. We certainly don't have all the species that were here in 1491, thinking before white people showed up in North America. In New Zealand right now, they're trying to do restoration that goes back before humanity showed up on the New Zealand island, 800 years ago. That's their target. How realistic are those things? So is the sun rising or setting in the future of our trees and our forests and our prairies? I think it's rising a bit. I'm hopeful. I'm involved in it, so I should be. Is that a sunrise or a sunset? It's a sunrise. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation and inviting me to talk to you about this. Thank you. Shall I depart?
Sure, thanks very much, Larry. For those who want to stay after the service for our social time, Larry, I'm sure will be happy to answer any questions. Wow.